Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be an interesting video. It's going to be the first of my tips and tricks video. So some how-tos on modeling. Some of them will be more basic, some of them will be a little bit more in depth. This is going to be episode 1, which is going to be modeling 101. So just the nice simple basics. And we'll go into what I plan to do, and you can see some of these basic techniques coming up in a couple of seconds here. But as always, my name is Sean, and this is Sean's Aviation. Okay, so for this episode we're going to do a little bit of just some basic modeling 101. I'm going to start with clipping parts off of sprues, cleaning them up, you know, a bit of X-Acto knife scraping, a little bit of file sanding, and then we'll do sort of some intro into gluing parts together. So a bit of back to basics for some of you, but for those who are sort of just getting into the hobby, hopefully you guys will be able to learn a little bit about this. So the basic tools that you're going to kind of want, this is sort of across the board, anybody building models. The basics you need a good pair of clippers. These are, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Xuron, X-U-R-O-N. They're a high-end pair of clippers. They cost maybe $15 to $20. I can't remember how much I paid for them, but they're definitely worth it. A good pair of cutting pliers. These are starting to get a little long in tooth. I've actually broken the tip off of one of the cutter blades, but it still serves a purpose. But I think it'll be about time to buy new ones relatively soon. I'll relegate these down to wire and stuff. I have different pairs. This set I only use on plastic. I have an older pair that I'll use to cut down, like as I said, wires or metal or anything like that. But you don't want to dull the blades too much, so I keep these strictly for plastic. So a good pair of clippers. You want a good X-Acto knife. This is actually one I found. I was at work. It was left. It fell out of somebody's bag. It was found on the ramp. So it's a nice. It's got a cover so I don't cut myself. A nice sharp number 11 blade. I found a good source of X-Acto blades on Amazon. It's like 100 blades for like $10 or something. They're actual X-Acto brand, so it's a nice, a nice good blade. Try to keep the blades relatively sharp. A dull blade doesn't solve anything. Just more dangerous, and it rips and tears plastic and can jump and skip and cut yourself. So good X-Acto with a good blade. Files, I have quite a bit of different files, all these different sizes. I got flat with a point, flat with a square tip. I got triangle, round. I got a square one. They allow you, the square and the triangle, for example, allow you to get into some tighter corners. The round one obviously works good for curves, and then a couple of different flat ones. Some with the pointed edge to get into points, flat edge. I usually use this guy. Nice wide surface, a square tip. This is what I use for my general cleanup. The other guys I usually use more for detail work after the fact. And it's always good to have a pair of tweezers. Again, I have a few different types. Curved edge, straight edge, and these guys are sort of reverse pliers. They stay shut and you squeeze to open. So if you need to hold a part, it's easy to mount a part into that and glue pieces to it. So it's always good to have a couple of different types of tweezers available. Again, I bought a big multi-pack and I just grab what I use and what I need at the time. So those are your basic tools to start with. So we'll start with these to show sort of general cleanup. So the first thing I'm going to do is I need to get the engine for this Focke-Wulf 190 off. So if you look at how they are mounted to the sprues, you'll see there's the part you need, and then they're connected with the little tabs here and here that hold it onto the sprue. So you want to cut the part off you'll see with the cutting pliers, they have sort of a flat edge and then an open edge. You kind of want the flat edge up against your part. Leave yourself a little bit of extra space. You want to leave a little tiny bit of the sprue on the part you need. So the part's actually cut out right now. It's just tension that holds it in place. You can just pop it off. One side didn't cut. So cut your piece out. We're now left with the basic piece you cut out with the little sort of nubs that you've left on. One on this side. Light over a little bit there. So you'll see there's one on this side here, and then one on the other side. Probably easier to see from the back. So you can see there's the one at the top and the one at the bottom, the little nub that sticks off. So the first thing I always do, I start big and work down. So you can get your X-Acto knife. I'll kind of hold it here so you can see the tip that sticks out. And I start near the tip and I just slowly eat away at that little nub. This is where a good X-Acto knife is good. If it's too dull, it just tears the plastic instead of cutting. So you can see I've worked that down to almost a little bump. So spin it around to the other side, and again, work kind of from the top of the piece, chew away at it bit by bit. Make sure you get as much of it down. Don't go too far with the knife, because you can easily gouge into the plastic and start cutting out from the actual part instead of just cutting off the sprue. So now you've got just a hint. You can almost barely tell anymore that there's a little piece. It's actually right there is where the mounting point is. It's just a little tiny bit. So I usually, depending on the shape of it, this being a round shape, what I'll usually do is take the file, lay it across, and use it across the circumference of the circle. That way you're not, again, you don't want to create a flat spot. If you just file like this and go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, you're going to flatten that end off and you're going to lose the shape. So if it's a round shape, I usually go with the circumference. Nice, long, wide. Start on one side, work across and work around. You want it to be nice and wide so that, again, you don't create a flat spot. And then same on the other side. Just go across the circumference. Until it's nice and smooth. And that's it. It's now ready to be, well, in this case I got to do some more work, but it's ready to be installed. It's finished product, it's good to go. So we'll get the next little piece here. So I now need this guy here. The accessories on the front. So again, you want to cut, leave a little tiny bit of your sprue on the part. And again, as I said before, use your knife, chip away at that little nub that stays sitting there. This one's a little easier because it's a flat surface, and then this side here is a curved surface. When I'm using a curved surface, I always follow the circumference. I don't want to come this way across from the front to the back, because again, you create a flat spot, you go to the side and you work around the circumference and just eat away at the part. There's also, maybe hard for you to see, there's a mold line running around this part. So while I'm doing this, even though it can create a flat spot, filing front to back sometimes is the only way to get into the part. So you can get in there, file away that mold seam. That's just where the two halves of the mold meet. The way, you know, plastic models are created, there's two molds that are put together, and then plastic gets injected into the middle. And when those two molds fit together, sometimes you get just a little bit of plastic that squeezes out into the gap between the two. It's very minuscule, it's almost more of a ridge than anything else, but it can be noticeable on the finished product. So just kind of go through. Here's a good example where one of the little square, the triangle parts would be nice because you can get inside this little gap in here and you can get up tight into the corners. Clean up that little ridge. And then across the top here on the flat spot where that other sprue piece was, doing because it's flat, it's nice and easy just to get in there with the file. And sand it away. So there you go. You've now got the two parts cleaned up and ready to go. I'll glue these parts together now before I lose them. So I'm just going to grab the instructions. It's always a good habit to never assume anything when you're building a model. Always make sure you have the instructions with you. So you'll see on the part at the top there's a little tab here, and then on the piece it fits on there's a little notch right here at the top. So the tab on the front lines up with that. It gives you a positive location, so if you put the piece on, it won't seat until you turn it, and the notch and the tab line up, and then that sits in there nice, and it's got a locking mechanism to ensure that it's nice and tight. So we'll do some gluing at this point. I have used many glues in the past. You know, I started with those Testors tube glues, a little orange tube. Don't recommend it. It's very messy. I then moved on to the Testors liquid glue, which is a much better process, and I currently use liquid glue still. I use the Tamiya glues. So I have two different types. I've got the Tamiya regular. It's a little on the thick side, so it's nice for flat surfaces. And then this is the extra thin, almost a water consistency. So it will run very easily, and will go into all the little nooks and crannies. So just to give you an example, I can open this guy up, and you can see the brush. It's got a brush connected to the cap. It's a nice thick, big brush, quite thick and gooey, whereas this has a nice fine brush, and as I said, it's almost water. So this you need to be very careful with, because it's very easy to get the glue everywhere, and it's hard to clean up because it's so thick. This is, for example, if you were going to be gluing two wings together, or two flat surfaces. This stuff works really well to get into the large mating areas. In a case of this part, you'll notice it does have a very large inner diameter of space. So you can start with the thick stuff. I would coat this top layer with the thick, and that just ensures that the part that touches, you can see how sort of thick and goo. I don't know if you can even see that. There's a nice sort of gooed layer across the top. You can kind of see it like that. And that ensures that the two parts, when they touch inside, lots of thick glue will ensure that that seam, you can already feel it binding, just a little bit of pressure, and it binds nice and tight. And then the thin, you can take it and you can run it along the seam, and just capillary action, just capillary action will suck that up inside the seam. You can always just give it a little bit more of a twist, put a bit of pressure on the part, give it a bit of twist back and forth, and it bonds. For those of you who don't know, plastic glue, I learned this the hard way when I was a kid. Plastic glue actually melts styrene. So you put the glue in place, it doesn't melt it completely, but it softens the plastic until it becomes pliable. If you actually glue two pieces together, but before it completely dries, you pull it apart, you'll see all these little strings start to form, and that's because the glue itself has melted and when fused together, and it dries fused together. So if you're pulling it apart before it's perfectly dry, all those little strings form. But if you put it together and you push, the more pressure you put, the farther those bonds will join. So giving it pressure and a bit of a twisting action will allow those plastics, when they meet, it'll actually push it and squeeze it and get it in there nice and bonded, and then it'll never come apart. So it just bonds all those molecules nice and tight. And there you go. The part is glued together. That will, you give that a couple of hours to dry, and it will almost act as one. Because I put the thick at the tip, that the thick glue will just bond like there's no tomorrow, and the thin glue along the bottom will just fill in all those gaps and basically ensure that, as I said, you will almost never get that apart. The bond will be stronger than the plastic itself, and you'll see that in a lot of cases where you glue two pieces of plastic together. For example, two wing halves. If you glue the two wings half together, when you go to pull it apart, the gluing surface, the edge is so strong that the plastic will rip across, and the middle of the plastic will rip before it debonds the gluing joint you've made. So it's a very strong joint. So that's the basics for clipping, sanding, cleaning up, and assembling basic parts. I don't recommend using this very often. You know, you need to be in a good situation when you use this. You don't want to use this for cockpit parts or whatnot. So I'm going to go on and do the next piece I need, just so you can see it all again. I'm not going to do as much talking in this case, and you'll be able to just kind of see what I'm doing. So here I'm going to take the center drop tank. So you trim it, leave a little bit of sprue on the part. If you get too close, you can actually, you feel like you want to get that flat surface super tight against your part and trim and leave as little as possible. But what can happen is when you do that, it will actually rip plastic out of the part. And on the part where the little nub sticks out, it will actually have a little indent and hole in the plastic because it's actually ripped that out. And then you end up having to go back and fill later. So it's just easier in the long run to leave that nub. So you take the knife, being the drop tanks now, this will be similar to doing, say, fuselage halves. There's two halves to the tank. So you want to go along, try to keep your knife perpendicular to the shape. If you come in, for example, if you look down the line, if you come in on an angle like this or like this, you're going to leave yourself extra work. You want to be almost perpendicular to the seam and just work your way across. Nice and slow, take off little bits at a time. You don't want to rip it, you want to slice it, you want to be neat and tidy again. If you're not careful, you try to go right to the base, it's possible to gouge into the plastic and leave divots that eventually will need filling. The way that this tank is designed, the seam runs around the outside edge, so you don't want to have a very noticeable gouge or seam that you then have to work on. So you want to be sure that when you do this, you do it right the first time. So take your file, just a little bit of cleaning. It's when I do this, I tend not to do too flat. I kind of curve because it will be a curved system. Come in and just kind of curve back and forth. Make sure that you're following the contour around and that you're not just creating a flat spot. You're sanding that divot out in a nice curve. So same with this part again. Start perpendicular and then kind of follow the curve around. Go a little bit too far. Always, it's better to go a little farther and sand a little bit of the area that doesn't need to be sanded than leave too little and have a little nub sticking out that is harder to clean later. So there you go. Two halves are clean. Now you'll see when model parts get put together, on the inside, one of them has pins and one of them has holes. And those are just locating pins. That just ensures that when you put the parts together, the pins and the holes line up and the part itself doesn't move around. So it helps you still have a bit of ability. You can still put it together a little off center and leave a significant step that needs to be filled. So it's not perfect. It just ensures that the more or less the lining up happens properly. So in this case also, you'll see that this part has a little tab that sticks up. So this is a perfect place where you can grab a pair of locking tweezers, like these ones, and now it's a little easier to hold. You're not trying to hold a tight little piece. You have it on a pair of tweezers and it gives you lots of easily holdable area, and that piece is locked in there pretty tight in order for you to glue stuff together. The way I usually do this, when you have something like this, take the piece that has the holes, and I'll use a little bit of this extra thin, fill up the entire hole. So when the pin goes in there, it's covered in glue. I will then go along in some strategic areas, usually both ends, and a couple of spots along the edge, and I just put a little bit of glue, and that just ensures that when you put the two halves together, those pins will fit into the holes and will give it lots of gluing surface and ensure that those pins lock into place. And then the little bits of glue I added along, almost like a spot weld, will hold it together enough that it won't come apart, but still gives me a little bit of time to kind of use my two fingers to line everything up. Make sure that the seam is as hidden as possible. What you want to do now, take a little bit more of this extra thin, go along and run it along the seam. You don't want to do the whole thing at once. Put a couple of, an inch or two, and then give that plastic a squeeze. And you'll actually be able to watch a little bit of plastic ooze up through that seam. And that tells you that it's bonding. The glue has melted the plastic. When you squeeze it together, that liquid plastic is oozing up between the seam, and you know that you've got yourself a nice, good, tight joint. So just go along, add a little bit of liquid glue all the way along. You'll actually notice that it starts to pull apart areas that have already been bonded as that glue's drying. You add more liquid glue, it softens up, and it'll start to pull apart again. But you just give it that nice squeeze, bit of pressure. You want to put quite a bit of pressure onto it, and you'll notice, again, it oozes up through the seam, and you've got yourself a nice tight joint. Flip it around to the other side. Again, bit of glue, bit of pressure. In cases on a fuselage, for example, I'll finish this up and then we'll show you. This is a very small part. There isn't a lot of seam to work on, and the two halves are square. You will have cases when you work on a larger piece like a wing or a fuselage where you'll get warpage in the parts. The parts don't want to work. I'll show you how that works, but there you go. It's nice tight. There's just a little tiny ridge of plastic sticking up out of the seam. You could probably see that there in the line. You can then go along and sand that little ridge away, and that'll almost completely disappear. And that is the basics for gluing two halves together. So you've seen with the engine, sort of two dissimilar parts. Cleaning them up, excuse me. Cleaning them up, assembling them, how to do the joint, and now sort of with two half parts. Same idea, cleaning them up and gluing them together. So these two parts right here are very a good example of what you will see across the board. Dissimilar parts and sort of similar half parts, mirror images of each other. That is 99% of what you'll end up doing when you're gluing models together. The one thing also to keep in mind, because the plastic liquid cement melts the plastic, you can't join dissimilar things. You can't glue metal to plastic with this. This is only for plastic to plastic joints. If you want to glue any other type of material to plastic, you need to use something like this. A cyanoacrylate. I can never pronounce that properly. Super glue. This is the stuff you want to use when you're doing some detail work. I'll do a video later on showing how to do, say, photo etch and some stuff like that. But this is just the basics of gluing plastic together. So as I was saying with warp parts, this is a good example. I'll zoom out here so you can see what I'm working on. This is the Italeri TA152, the long-nosed, long-winged version of a Focke-Wulf. But what you'll notice is if you go to the tail and you line your tail up accurately and perfectly, your nose is wide open. There's a huge... It's actually very hard to get this to line up properly, but this is a perfect example of where problems are. You'll notice that it's very hard to get the tail to line up properly, and when you do, the nose is way, way out. So as you start gluing, it's harder to keep things aligned. So in a case like this, right, you can start at, say, the tail. You could tape it together and start gluing across this bottom seam and just get this back part right here sort of glued together, just behind and just in front of your wheel well. Glue that together, let it dry. Now you can flip it around and that bottom part is locked, and you can work your way across the top of the tail, let it dry. Work your way up the rear fuselage until you reach this cockpit opening. let it dry, right? Do it step by step by step, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, and then by that point, that whole sort of rear fuselage is locked together. And now it's going to be easier to keep everything in line. Now you can work up and glue this part, for example, up to this edge. Let it sit and dry. Now you've got your entire rear fuselage done. Flip it over, and you can work your way. As you can easily see how hard this is to keep lined up. It just keeps popping out as I'm even holding it. And then you can work your way down this nose. And because your tail is glued together and will have a pop apart, it is very easy to say, put a piece of tape here on the nose and paint this, glue this little section here. By the time that's dry, you know, that's holding itself together. The gap at the top is very, very tiny. So it gets very easy to just work your way up step by step. Glue, let dry, glue, let dry, glue, let dry. Give it an hour or two, work your way around step by step, and you can easily put a model together that has a severe warp, and you can get the warp out of it. So don't rush, don't do everything in one shot. Try to get as much of it done, as little done as possible to keep warps to a minimum. Another part, another item I have found and used in the past is this liquid cement for plastic models. It's a tester's product, but it comes with this very fine application tip. So this is good for when you want a thicker glue than the Tamiya liquid. It's got this has the consistency of the thick Tamiya, but because it's got such a small application point, it's much easier to apply than, for example, this thick stuff. So if you're gluing two wing halves together, at the tip, the majority of this surface will actually touch this surface. So it's very easy to use this applicator tip and go along and get a clean sort of bead of glue along the outside edge, right? And the Tamiya thin will dry up and evaporate quite quickly, whereas this will stay thicker and will give you more working time. So you can go along on the tip, add sort of a bead of the thicker glue along the outer edge, along the back here on the flap where you've got some really good sort of coverage. And then when you use your liquid on the holes, right, by the time you put it together, you'll have sort of a spot weld here, here, and then a good solid joint all the way around. Let it dry for a bit, and then you can work across with the liquid in the front and start closing up those seams. So this has its benefit. I am still a big fan of the Tamiya, but you know, every little bit helps. So you know, this is, you know, you don't want to run out and spend all this money. This is just stuff I've bought over the years and I still have. So the longer you're in it, the more stuff you acquire, the easier it becomes to do some of this work. Yeah, so I will do some more examples. For example, you know, possibly. So here's an example of what I was talking about when it comes to gluing fuselages together. This is just a quickly sped up video of a couple of days worth of work. So here's the thick glue. You can see I'm applying to some of the mating surfaces and some of the pins and whatnot, so then you get it all lined up. Take your time, make sure everything lines up nice and well. You don't want to find it after the fact. So a bit of tape to hold the fuselage together, a bit of pressure on that seam. Make sure that you got a nice solid bond. You want to make sure you see a little bit of the glue and the melted plastic oozing out from between the two seams. So you can see there, and I have a bit of pressure, and then you can use the thin stuff. You work along the seam, and as I said with the engine components there, capillary action will pull that up through the seam. So it doesn't take much to get everything done, and then like I said, just keep adding pressure. And then some more tape there to hold it together. And then across the spine, you'll see I try to avoid applying to any painted surfaces. So here I am working along the belly, some of that lower seam that I didn't get the first time, come along, add the glue, add a bit of pressure. You can see me there, a bit of pressure. You can kind of see a little bit of that ridge forming between the seam line. Work my way up, make sure every little area has some glue. If there's a little spot that doesn't look like there's any glue, then you want to make sure you get it in there. You don't want to leave any voids. So again, here you go, bit of pressure, make sure it's nice and tight. Then here we go along the nose. You can see I've added more tape to hold the nose together. Glue the seam like a little paintbrush. Make sure it's nice and tight. Bit of pressure. Look for the ooze. You'll see here I'm going to flip that upside down. I'll put glue from the inside. And if you have that option, it's always good to get glue on both sides. There you go. So there you go. There's the basics of cleaning up parts and gluing some parts together. Everything else you do is just the basically what I just did. Whether you're gluing Gluing a fuselage together is just like gluing the fuel tank together. Gluing wings together is just like gluing the fuel tank together. Gluing a wheel well bay into the fuselage is the same as gluing the engine parts together. Gluing cockpit pieces together, exactly the same as how I glue those engines together, those two engine parts together. You just add a bit of glue on one, put the piece on the other, let it dry, and that's it. So it's all basically runs from that. The key to it all is take your time. You don't want to rush. You know, it's the old adage, measure twice, cut once. Read your instructions, go over the parts, make sure you know how they fit, dry fit them together, hold them together on your own, see where the problem areas are, get a good idea and a plan for how you're going to glue it together. And once you understand what part goes where, and you've made yourself a plan, and in your mind you can picture how it's all going to work, you know, have all your parts ready, and then start gluing things together. And wait. You know, you don't want to glue two parts together and try to glue a third part on while those two parts are wet, because then things just start to fall apart. Glue the two parts together, let it dry. Glue the next part on, let it dry. Glue the next part on, let it dry. You know, sometimes you only have to wait 5 minutes between parts. The glue doesn't take long to dry up. 5 minutes should be enough for two things to bond quite, you know, solid enough for you to glue another part on. When it comes to, for example, sanding, I've glued this together just a few minutes ago. I'm going to wait for about an hour, maybe two, before I come back and sand it. Just ensure that all of those chemicals that are in the glue have evaporated off, and that is a nice solid joint before I start sanding. So don't rush. One of the reasons why I build multiple models at a time, I can do something on model A. While I'm waiting for it to dry, I can do something on model B, etc., etc., etc. By the time I get to the last one, I can usually go back and kind of do the next step on the first one. So that's the basics. Again, anybody have any questions, comments, any better ideas? If you guys have a technique you want me to try out or show an example of, by all means, leave the comment down below, and I will do my best to show you guys what I can do. So on that note, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.
Thank you for watching, guys, and as always, if you are interested in any of the content you see, you can access my website at www.seans-aviation.com. You can see all the latest pictures of aircraft and museums and the build logs of all of my current models and past models on that site. And if you're interested in any of this content, please click the subscribe button here on YouTube to follow more. Thank you very much, and see you guys next time.